In a high-end restaurant, a ruthless chef humiliates an elderly black dishwasher, convinced he's untouchable. But what he doesn't know? The silent customer watching from the corner isn't just anyone. It's Big Shaq, the owner. And when respect is on the line, Shaq doesn't just stand by. He steps in. Tonight, the real power in the kitchen is about to be revealed. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The restaurant buzzed with the kind of energy only a high-end establishment could maintain during peak hours. Sharp clinks of silverware, the rhythmic chopping of knives, the occasional bark of an order called out across the kitchen. This was the Iron Oak, one of the most exclusive dining spots in the city, known for its elite clientele, world-class cuisine, and a head chef who ruled his kitchen like a battlefield. Tonight, though, a man walked in who didn't fit the usual mold. He was big, bigger than anyone in the room. But he didn't carry himself with arrogance. He moved with ease, like someone used to attention but unbothered by it. Dressed in a simple hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, he looked like just another customer, maybe an athlete or a businessman unwinding after a long day. But this wasn't just anyone. This was Shaquille O'Neal, the owner of the restaurant. A man worth millions, yet here, just another face in the crowd. He didn't announce himself. He never did. Instead, he slipped through the side entrance, blending in with the kitchen staff. He had done this before, showing up unannounced, watching, learning. He didn't believe in fancy reports or sugar-coated feedback. He wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. And tonight, the truth was about to reveal itself in the ugliest way. At the center of the storm was Jameson Carter, the head chef. He was everything you expected from a man who let power go to his head, sharp-tongued, impatient, and utterly convinced of his own importance. He wasn't just running a kitchen. He was running a kingdom. And in this kingdom, there were two kinds of people, those who were useful and those who were invisible. Earl fell into the second category. The elderly black dishwasher had been working at the Iron Oak for over a decade. A quiet man, he never complained, never caused trouble. He just worked, hours on his feet, hands submerged in hot, soapy water, scrubbing away the evidence of another perfect meal. And yet, to Jameson, Earl was just a shadow in the corner. "Earl, you asleep back there?" Jameson's voice cut through the kitchen, sharp as the knives on the counter. "Move your ass. We got plates stacking up." Earl flinched but nodded, working faster. He didn't talk back. He never did. Shaq watched from the far end of the kitchen, standing near the doorway. His eyes followed the scene carefully. He had seen this before, not just here, but in life. The ones in power pushing down on the ones they thought wouldn't push back. Jameson strutted across the kitchen, barking orders at the younger chefs. "Sauce on table 4 is too thick. Get it right, or get out of my kitchen." His presence was overwhelming, but not in a way that inspired confidence. It inspired fear. The younger staff avoided eye contact, their movements robotic, calculated. They had learned the hard way that stepping out of line meant a verbal beating that could break even the most hardened souls. Jameson turned back toward the dishwashing station, sneering. "Earl, you deaf now too? I said move faster. Or do you need me to find someone younger?" Silence. The whole kitchen went still. Earl didn't respond, just kept scrubbing, shoulders tense but unshaken. The insult had landed, but he had long since learned to endure. Jameson smirked, shaking his head. "Damn shame. Some people don't know when their time is up." Shaq's jaw tightened. There it was. The kind of casual cruelty that came from a man too comfortable in his own power. Shaq stepped forward, slow and deliberate. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to announce his presence. He let the weight of his frame do the talking. A few chefs noticed him now, their eyes flicking to his towering figure. But Jameson? He still had no idea who was standing behind him. And that was going to be his first mistake. Jameson turned, finally noticing Shaq standing there. His expression twisted into one of immediate disdain. "You lost, big guy?" he asked, looking him up and down. His tone was dismissive, dripping with condescension. "This ain't the dining room." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Nah, just watching." Jameson snorted. "Watching what? Dishes get cleaned? Ain't much of a show. Shaq didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at Earl, then back at Jameson. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm even. You always talk to your staff like that? Jameson's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who looked like just another customer wandering where he didn't belong. I run my kitchen how I see fit, Jameson said, crossing his arms. You a food critic or something? Shaq chuckled, low and quiet. Something like that. Jameson huffed, waving a dismissive hand. Look, man, I don't got time for tourists. If you're here to eat, go sit your ass in the dining room. If you're here to work, grab a damn apron. Shaq smiled, but there was no warmth behind it, just patience. Dangerous patience. I'll stick around, he said simply. Jameson scoffed, turning back to his work. Whatever, man. Just stay out of the way. Shaq watched the next hour unfold like a script he'd seen 100 times before. Jameson barked orders, belittled employees, and carried himself like a king with no throne. His power came from fear, not respect. And Earl? Earl just kept working, even as the insults stacked up like the dishes in front of him. Shaq leaned against the counter, arms crossed. He wasn't here to flex his power, not yet. He wanted to see how far Jameson would go when he thought no one important was watching. And Jameson? He was digging his own grave, one insult at a time. Finally, the moment came. Earl reached for a heavy stack of plates, hands trembling from hours of work. One slipped. It shattered against the floor. The kitchen froze. Jameson's head snapped up, eyes locking onto Earl like a predator spotting its weakest prey. The rage came fast. Are you kidding me? His voice boomed through the kitchen, bouncing off the steel walls. Earl bent down immediately, hands shaking as he started gathering the shards. I'm sorry, boss, Jameson stepped closer, voice dripping with venom. Sorry? That's what you got? You're slow, you're clumsy, and now you're wasting my damn time? Earl flinched, but didn't argue, and that was the moment Shaq had been waiting for. He pushed off the counter, his voice cutting through the thick tension like a blade. You done? Jameson blinked, turning sharply. Excuse me? Shaq nodded toward Earl, his face unreadable. You got it out of your system? Or you need a few more minutes to feel big? A few employees hid their smirks, suddenly aware that the power dynamic in the room had just shifted. Jameson, however, wasn't laughing. His jaw tightened. Who the hell do you think you are? Shaq's answer was simple. The guy watching you dig yourself into a hole. And just like that, the real game had begun. The air inside the Iron Oaks kitchen was thick with tension, the kind that settled in places where one man ruled and everyone else endured. The clang of metal, the hiss of steam, and the rhythmic chopping of knives masked an undercurrent of fear. A silent agreement that no one stepped out of line unless they were ready to be cut down by the voice of the man in charge. That voice belonged to Jameson Carter. To an outsider, Jameson might seem like a perfectionist, a chef obsessed with his craft. But to the people working under him, he was a dictator draped in a white coat. A man who wielded authority like a weapon. A man whose idea of leadership was breaking others down until they feared him more than failure itself. And tonight, he was hunting for a victim. Jameson's sharp blue eyes scanned the kitchen, always looking, always ready to pounce on the weakest link. He didn't care about respect. He didn't care about loyalty. He cared about control. And control, to him, was something that had to be enforced. Then it happened. The moment he'd been waiting for. Across the kitchen, at the far end where no one paid much attention, a plate slipped from aged hands and shattered against the floor. The crack of ceramic against tile ripped through the room, louder than the rush of boiling pots, louder than the frantic shuffling of feet. Silence. Total. Suffocating silence. Every pair of eyes darted toward the dishwashing station, toward the frail figure frozen in place. Earl. The old man stood there, his back slightly hunched, hands trembling as he stared at the broken plate. He already knew what was coming. Jameson's lips curled into a sneer, like a wolf sensing wounded prey. He took his time, wiping his hands on a pristine towel before striding toward Earl, his footsteps slow, deliberate, Then he struck. You serious right now? Jameson's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and mocking. How many damn times we gotta do this, old man? Earl swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he bent down, his fingers moving to gather the shards. His hands shook, but he didn't say a word. Jameson let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. Slow, clumsy, and still collecting a paycheck. What exactly are we paying you for, huh? The younger kitchen staff kept their heads down, their bodies moving, but their ears wide open. No one wanted to be next. No one wanted to interrupt the storm. Jameson crouched slightly, lowering his voice just enough for the words to drip with venom. You don't belong here, Earl. You hear me? You're in the wrong place. Always have been. Earl flinched, not at the words, but at the truth behind them. He had heard worse, lived through worse. But some wounds never heal, no matter how many years pass. And Shaq saw it all. From his seat near the kitchen's entrance, he hadn't moved. His arms were still crossed, his expression unreadable. But his eyes? His eyes told a different story. For the last hour, Shaq had watched Jameson operate, watched the way he carried himself like a king among peasants. He had seen the fear in the staff's faces, the way they worked harder not to perfect their craft, but to avoid being noticed. And now, Jameson had noticed him. The chef's gaze snapped toward the towering figure sitting in the corner, still and silent. For the first time, there was something in Jameson's expression that looked uncertain, as if he had only just realized that this man had been there the whole time, watching. Jameson's ego didn't allow discomfort for long. You got a problem, big guy? He asked, tilting his head. Shaq let the question hang in the air for a moment before finally speaking. Nah, just watching. Jameson let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head like he had just heard something ridiculous. Yeah? Well, you got something to say. Go ahead. Otherwise, mind your damn business. Shaq said nothing. He just stared. And Jameson didn't like it. The power in the room shifted, if only slightly. Shaq hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved an inch. But there was something in his silence, in the weight of his presence, that made Jameson uneasy. The kitchen staff had felt it too. For the first time, Jameson wasn't the biggest force in the room. He scoffed, turning his attention back to Earl, needing to reclaim his dominance. Clean this up and try not to break anything else, he snapped, rolling his eyes. I swear, we'd be better off hiring a damn teenager. Earl nodded quietly, his hands steadying as he gathered the last of the broken pieces. Jameson turned back to Shaq, sizing him up once more. The irritation was creeping into his voice now. You just gonna sit there all night, or you actually plan on ordering something? Shaq leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. You always talk to your people like that? Jameson narrowed his eyes. My people? Shaq motioned toward the kitchen, toward the employees who hadn't spoken, hadn't looked up, hadn't dared to breathe too loudly since the argument started. Jameson scoffed, shaking his head. You don't run a kitchen by holding hands and singing songs, buddy. You keep 'em in line. You push 'em. That's how you get respect. Shaq nodded slowly, as if considering the words. Then he leaned back again, arms crossing over his chest. That what you think this is? Respect? Jameson clenched his jaw, the muscles in his neck tightening. I don't know who the hell you are, man, but if you came here looking for a damn debate, you're in the wrong place. Shaq exhaled through his nose, a slow, measured breath. Nah. Looks like I'm right where I need to be. The kitchen was silent again, the tension curling like smoke in the air. The staff was watching. They weren't sure what was happening, but they knew it was something. Jameson felt it too. For the first time in years, he wasn't just talking down to someone. He was being challenged. And he didn't like it one bit. With one last glance at Shaq, Jameson let out a sharp exhale and turned away, muttering under his breath. Damn customers think they know everything. Shaq didn't respond. He just let the words sit there, knowing the real lesson was coming soon. Because Jameson had no idea who he had just written off as a nobody. And by the time he figured it out, it would be too damn late. Jameson's kitchen had rules, unspoken, but enforced. He was the center of the universe. No one questioned him. No one defied him. And sure as hell, no one sat there watching him like they had something to say. Yet there he was, this massive guy, sitting back like he had all the time in the world, like he wasn't fazed at all. Jameson wiped his hands on his apron, turning fully toward him. If there was one thing he couldn't stand, it was someone thinking they were above him. You a food critic or just another oversized nobody? He smirked, sizing Shaq up. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't react. He just leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, and took a slow sip of his drink. Nah, he said finally. Just watching. Jameson let out a short, sharp laugh. Watching. That was cute. The kitchen wasn't a damn spectator sport. It was his world. And if this guy thought he could just sit there, acting all cool and silent, Jameson was going to make sure he regretted it. You always just watch? Or you actually do something useful with your size? Jameson taunted, giving Shaq an exaggerated once-over. Let me guess. Failed athlete? Security guard? Nah. You look like one of those guys who sits outside a club nodding at rich folks while they walk past. You. Shaq let the words hang in the air. He wasn't in a rush. He set his glass down, exhaling slowly, like he was giving Jameson time to reconsider. Jameson, of course, didn't take the hint. Nothing to say now? He grinned. What, cat got your tongue? Thought you were watching, big man. You like what you see? Shaq's lips curled into the smallest smirk, but his eyes, they didn't match. Oh, I see a lot, he said, voice smooth. Just trying to figure out if you know what you're doing. That hit differently. Jameson's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but ego doesn't like silence, and it sure as hell doesn't like doubt. I don't know what I'm doing, he echoed, barking out another laugh. Buddy, I run the best kitchen in this whole damn city. You know how many people would kill to work under me? Shaq nodded, slow, measured. Yeah? That why they all look like they'd rather be anywhere else? That one landed. Jameson's jaw tightened, but he covered it fast. Listen, man, I don't know who you think you are, but you don't just waltz into my kitchen and start running your mouth. Your kitchen? Shaq repeated, raising an eyebrow. Jameson puffed up his chest. This was his turf. Damn right. And if you don't like how I run things, doors that way. Shaq tilted his head slightly. See? That's funny. Jameson scoffed. Yeah? What's funny, big guy? Shaq's voice stayed level, his tone almost amused. That you think you're in charge. The kitchen stilled again. The younger staff, who had been keeping their heads down, couldn't help but steal glances now. This was new. No one ever talked to Jameson like that. Jameson felt the shift, but he couldn't back down now. His authority was being tested in his own domain. If he let this slide, he'd lose every ounce of control. So he took a step closer. You got a smart mouth for someone who don't belong here, he said, voice quieter but laced with hostility. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. Guess that makes two of us. Jameson's nostrils flared. This was not how this was supposed to go. He wasn't used to people like this, not just big, but unshakable. He knew how to handle loudmouths, how to shut down whiners, how to humiliate weak links. But Shaq wasn't reacting the way he wanted. He should have been angry, or embarrassed, or at least trying to explain himself. Instead, he was just sitting there like a mountain, like he wasn't even sweating this. And the worst part? The rest of the kitchen was watching. Jameson needed to get the upper hand. Fast. He scoffed, shaking his head dramatically, trying to turn the moment into something he could laugh off. All right, big man. You got a lot to say. What? You think you can do better? You think running a kitchen is easy? Shaq didn't miss a beat. Nah. Jameson smirked, thinking he'd won something. Exactly. So why don't you? But I do think respect's easy. Shaq interrupted. Jameson stopped mid-sentence. Shaq leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His voice stayed steady, but there was a weight to it now. Don't gotta scream to get it. Don't gotta tear people down. Just gotta have it in you. Jameson's face darkened. He wasn't an idiot. He knew when he was being called out. And now, the kitchen wasn't just watching. They were listening. Jameson could feel it slipping. The control, the fear, the power he held over this place. He needed to get it back. You got a lot of opinions for someone who ain't done a damn thing in here, he snapped. You don't know what it takes to keep this place running. You don't know what pressure looks like. Shaq tilted his head. You think you know pressure? Jameson crossed his arms. I know pressure better than anybody. Shaq let out a slow chuckle. Pressure ain't screaming at a dishwasher, he said. Pressure ain't talking big when you think no one can check you. Jameson's grip tightened around his towel. He felt cornered, but he wouldn't show it. You think you're some kind of expert? He challenged. You don't know me. You don't know what I've built here. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. Yeah, I do. I know exactly what you built. Jameson tensed. A kitchen where people move faster out of fear than passion, Shaq continued. Where respect don't exist, only survival. He nodded toward the younger chefs, who quickly looked away, guilty for being noticed. You ain't a leader. You're just the loudest voice in the room. Jameson's face turned red. That's so? He sneered. And what the hell would you know about running a place like this? Shaq didn't answer right away. He let the moment breathe, let Jameson sit in it. Then finally he stood up. The kitchen felt smaller. Jameson took a half step back, instinctively, before catching himself. And that's when it hit him. Something was wrong. The air, the way the staff was looking at Shaq now. There was something they knew that Jameson didn't. His pulse kicked up a notch. Who the hell are you? He asked, his voice not as sharp as before. Shaq smiled. And for the first time that night, Jameson felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Uneasy. Lunch rush at the Iron Oak wasn't just busy, it was war. Pans clattered against burners, knives slammed into cutting boards, voices overlapped as waiters shouted orders into an already overwhelmed kitchen. Steam billowed from boiling pots, mixing with the heavy scent of butter, garlic, and seared meat. Chaos lived here. And Jameson thrived in it. He stormed through the kitchen like he was commanding an army, weaving between stations, checking plates, screaming corrections at chefs who already knew they'd never be good enough in his eyes. Too much salt. What the hell is this? Are we trying to kill him? Sauce should be on the side, not drowning the damn plate. If you screw up that steak again, you're eating the cost out of your paycheck. The staff moved like shadows, blending into the background, doing everything they could to stay unnoticed. No one wanted to be the next target. But then, Jameson found exactly what he was looking for. At the dishwashing station, Earl was falling behind. The stacks of dirty plates were growing faster than he could clean them, his wrinkled hands struggling to keep up with the relentless flow. His back was tight, his breathing heavier than usual. But he wasn't slowing down. He couldn't. Jameson smelled weakness like blood in the water. Jesus, Earl, you planning on getting those plates clean before the next damn century? Earl kept scrubbing, shoulders tensing. Jameson stepped closer, voice dripping with irritation. Maybe you didn't hear me. I said move it. I'm trying, Earl muttered, barely above a whisper. Jameson wasn't interested in excuses. No, you're failing, like always. The kitchen went still, despite the rush. The insult landed with a dull thud, a weight that settled into the air, thick and heavy. But Jameson wasn't done. You are dead weight, old man, he spat. Should have been replaced years ago. Hell, you should be thanking me for keeping you around. You know damn well no one else would hire you. Earl froze. His hand still held the sponge, water running over his fingers, but he wasn't scrubbing anymore. His head dipped slightly, not in submission, but something quieter, something deeper. Shaq saw it, and that's when he spoke. You talk a lot. Shaq's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade, smooth but heavy. For someone who ain't listening. It was sharp, director, unmissable. The entire kitchen turned at once, their heads snapping toward Shaq like a reflex. Jameson did too, blinking as if he'd forgotten Shaq was even there. Then, he laughed. Loud, exaggerated, forced. Oh, here we go, he grinned, shaking his head. What now? Big guy's got something to say? Shaq didn't move from where he sat. He didn't need to. I got a question, he said simply. Jameson folded his arms. Oh, this ought to be good. All right, big man. Hit me. Shaq's eyes flicked to Earl, then back to Jameson. What did he do to you? Jameson blinked. What? What did he do to you? Shaq repeated steady. He take your money? Lie to you? Hurt your family? Jameson huffed, rolling his eyes. Man, don't start with that moral high ground crap. Nah, I'm serious, Shaq interrupted, voice still calm, but there was something under it now. You got a whole kitchen of people running around, messing up orders, dropping plates, slowing you down, but you don't talk to them like you talk to him. Jameson's smirk faltered. Just for a second. Shaq let the silence sit. You got a problem with slow? Shaq continued, tilting his head slightly. Cool. Fire him. But you don't want to do that. Instead, you'd rather tear him down while you keep him here. So I'm asking again. What did he do to you? Jameson's jaw clenched. This is my damn kitchen, he snapped. And if you don't like how I run things, there's the door. Shaq let out a small chuckle. See, now you sound scared. Jameson's head jerked back slightly, as if someone had just swung at him. The kitchen staff wasn't moving anymore. The orders were still coming in, the timers were still going off, but no one was focused on the food anymore. Everyone was focused on Jameson, and Jameson was feeling it. His authority, his control, all of it was slipping. And the worst part? Shaq wasn't even trying. Jameson let out a breath, forcing another grin. All right, big guy, you got jokes. Cute. But I don't answer to you. Shaq nodded slowly. You right. Jameson smirked, thinking he had won. But then Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You answer to them. His head tilted toward the kitchen staff, the ones who had been holding their breath, the ones who had spent months, years, avoiding Jameson's wrath. Now they weren't avoiding him anymore. They were watching him, waiting. Jameson felt the shift like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth, ready to say something, anything, but nothing came out. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. The air had changed. The power had shifted. And Jameson Carter was finally realizing he wasn't in control anymore. Jameson had lost his grip on the room, and he knew it. The tension in the air was no longer something he controlled. It was something pressing down on him, something he couldn't shake off. The staff, the waiters, even the dishwashers, they were all watching him now, and not in fear, but curiosity. They were waiting to see what he would do next. And that realization, it pissed him off. So he did what men like him always did when their authority was slipping. He doubled down. Jameson squared his shoulders, scoffing as he looked Shaq up and down. His lip curled, eyes narrowing in obvious disdain. And then came the line, the one he thought would knock Shaq down a peg. Big guy like you should stick to lifting weights, not sticking his nose in a kitchen. A few of the younger cooks held their breath. Some of them shifted slightly like they were waiting for an explosion. But Shaq? Shaq just smirked. Calm, unbothered, completely in control. And a loud guy like you, he said smoothly, should try leading instead of barking. Boom. The words landed like a grenade in the center of the kitchen, quiet but deafening. Someone near the grill choked back a laugh. A line cook pretending to check a sauce hid his grin behind his ladle. Jameson saw it, all of it, and it lit a fire in him. His hands clenched at his sides. He was not about to be made a fool of in his own damn kitchen. You got a real smart mouth for someone who don't belong here, he snapped, voice tight. Shaq shrugged. I've been hearing that my whole life. Ain't ever meant much. Jameson let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. You think you're funny? Shaq exhaled, slow and deliberate. Nah, just thinking out loud. Jameson could feel the shift happening again. Shaq wasn't just calling him out, he was dismantling him piece by piece. This wasn't how things worked. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one who got the last word. And yet, here was this nobody, this oversized stranger who hadn't lifted a damn finger, who hadn't raised his voice once, turning the entire damn room against him. Jameson felt his pulse spike. He needed to put this guy back in his place. So he stepped closer, voice lowering into something quieter, sharper. You don't know a damn thing about me. Shaq finally leaned in, resting his elbows on the table, looking Jameson in the eyes for the first time that night. And when he spoke, His voice was still calm, still steady. But now, there was weight behind it. "What's really bothering you?" Shaq asked, tilting his head slightly. "That I see through you?" Jameson's breath hitched for just a second. Shaq didn't break eye contact. "See, you talk like a man who got everything figured out," he continued. "Like you built this place from the ground up with your bare hands. But I've been watching you all night, and you know what I see?" Jameson's jaw tightened. "Don't act like you know me. I see a man who ain't half as strong as he pretends to be." Jameson's eye twitched, a flicker of something vulnerable, buried so deep beneath his ego that even he probably didn't recognize it. Shaq saw it, so he kept going. "You think control is screaming at people who can't fight back," Shaq said. "You think power is making a kitchen scared of you. But real power?" He let the words linger, heavy and unshakable. "Real power don't need to prove itself." Jameson swallowed, but it felt like razor blades going down his throat. Because deep down, he knew Shaq was right. But admitting that? Impossible. So Jameson did the only thing he knew how to do. He got nastier. "You some kind of motivational speaker now?" he sneered, crossing his arms. "That what this is? You gonna hit me with some rise and grind speech about teamwork and respect?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, I just don't like bullies." The room went silent again, and that's when it happened. That's when Jameson finally broke, because deep down he knew that's exactly what he was. A bully. A man who ran his kitchen not with skill, not with leadership, but with fear. And now, fear wasn't working. The control he thought he had, it wasn't real. Shaq had ripped the mask off without even trying, and now Jameson was standing there, exposed for everyone to see. He needed a way out. Something, anything, to take back control. So he laughed again, hollow and forced. "You don't like bullies? That's cute, big guy," he said. "But let me tell you how the real world works, people like you." He gestured at Shaq's size. "You get by on brute strength. You don't gotta think. You don't gotta work twice as hard. Everything just gets handed to you." Shaq's smile didn't fade, but something in his eyes changed. He leaned back again, completely at ease, while Jameson stood there, body tensed like a coiled spring. "You really believe that?" Shaq asked. Jameson didn't answer, because suddenly he wasn't sure anymore. The way, Shaq was looking at him now, calm, patient, almost amused. It made Jameson feel something he hadn't felt in years. Small. He opened his mouth, ready to say something else, but before he could, a voice from behind cut through the tension. "Order up for table 7! Jameson's head jerked toward the line cook, who immediately looked like he regretted speaking. But the moment had been broken. The spell had been shattered. And Jameson? He was losing. Not just this argument. The whole damn kitchen. The way the staff was looking at Shaq now, not in fear, not in amusement, but in something dangerously close to respect, it made Jameson's stomach turn. He had spent years making sure that he was the only one who commanded that kind of respect in this kitchen. And in one damn night, this stranger had taken it away. He had to fix this. He had to get it back. Because if he didn't, he wasn't just going to lose an argument. He was going to lose everything. And Jameson Carter didn't know how to lose. The kitchen had turned into a battlefield of silence. Jameson stood there, fists clenched at his sides, nostrils flaring, face red from a mixture of frustration and something dangerously close to humiliation. His entire body was wound tight, coiled like a snake about to strike, and yet, Shaq wasn't flinching. He hadn't moved an inch. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't done anything except sit there, watching, waiting. And that was what was driving Jameson insane. The staff wasn't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Shaq. At the way he sat, calm and collected. At the way he spoke, unshaken and unbothered. They saw something in him that Jameson didn't have, and Jameson hated it. So he snapped. "You got something to say?" Jameson barked, voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Say it." Shaq finally moved, slowly, deliberately. He reached up, fingers gripping the edges of his hoodie, and in one smooth motion he pulled it off. And then, everything stopped. The kitchen froze. The clatter of pans, the rhythmic chopping of knives, the hurried shuffle of feet, all of it ceased in an instant. Because now they could see him clearly, see the unmistakable face that had been on TV screens, magazine covers, and basketball courts. See the man they'd watched dominate games, sign million-dollar deals, and build empires. A name they all knew. A name Jameson knew. Shaquille O'Neal, the owner of the damn restaurant. A visible chill ran through the kitchen. The younger chefs exchanged glances, their eyes wide with realization. Someone near the grill accidentally dropped a spoon, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. Jameson? Jameson didn't move, didn't blink. His face drained of all color. His mouth opened slightly, like he was about to say something, but nothing came out. Shaq, still calm as ever, let the moment settle. He gave Jameson a second to fully understand what had just happened. Then, with a slow, easy smirk, he spoke. Funny thing about power, Shaq mused, his deep voice smooth but carrying unmistakable weight. Jameson's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Shaq leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. It don't come from yelling, he continued. It comes from respect. Jameson felt those words hit like bricks to the chest. The staff was watching him now, not in fear, but in disbelief. For months, years, he had made himself the biggest presence in the kitchen. Louder, stronger, meaner than everyone else. He had built his power on intimidation, on dominance. And now, he looked small. Shaq sat there, not needing to raise his voice, not needing to threaten or demand obedience. And yet, in that moment, he was the most powerful man in the room. Jameson forced a breath, his chest rising and falling a little too quickly. His mind raced for an escape route, something to brush this off, to pretend he hadn't just humiliated himself in front of the owner of the restaurant. Look, man, Shaq raised a hand. A simple gesture, but it shut Jameson up instantly. You had your turn to talk, Shaq said, voice calm, measured. Now it's mine. Jameson clenched his jaw, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to argue, to fight back, to defend himself. But he knew. He knew he couldn't. So he stayed quiet. Shaq sat back again, his massive frame relaxed. You've been running this place like a dictator, he said. Like respect is something you can force instead of something you gotta earn. But that's not how real leadership works. Jameson's face burned, his mind desperate to justify himself. You think I just let people slack off? Jameson snapped. This is a business. You want it to run smooth, you gotta push people. Shaq raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Push 'em, huh? Jameson exhaled sharply. You wouldn't understand. You don't know how hard it is to keep people in line, to make sure they do their damn jobs. You sit up in an office somewhere, sign some papers, and collect your check. You don't know what it's like down here. Shaq tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. Then he chuckled. The sound wasn't amused. You really think I don't know hard work? Shaq asked. That I don't know what it's like to earn respect? Jameson didn't respond. He couldn't. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. Let me tell you something, Jameson. He gestured toward the staff, the ones still standing motionless, waiting for what came next. These people? Shaq continued. They don't respect you. They fear you. And that ain't the same thing. Jameson's pulse kicked up. Shaq leaned forward again, his voice lowering just enough to make Jameson feel like this was just between them. You don't lead a team by making them feel small, Shaq said. You lead by making them want to be better, by showing them how it's done, by bringing them up. Jameson's fingers tightened against his apron. He didn't want to hear this, because deep down, he knew Shaq was right. He just didn't want to admit it. You done? Jameson muttered, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then finally, he nodded. Yeah, he said. I'm done. Jameson forced himself to stand taller, to act like he still had some control left. Good, he snapped. Then get the hell out of my kitchen. Shaq raised an eyebrow, as if waiting for Jameson to realize what he'd just said. Then it hit. Jameson's stomach dropped. It wasn't his kitchen. It never had been. Shaq owned the damn place. And now? Jameson was standing in front of the one man who had the power to take everything away from him. Shaq stood up, his sheer size making Jameson feel even smaller. The kitchen stayed deathly silent. Shaq looked down at him, expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he turned toward the rest of the staff. "Y'all get back to work," he said, voice calm but firm. The chefs snapped into motion instantly, eager to get as far away from the moment as possible. Jameson stood frozen, his body numb. Shaq started to walk away but paused, turning back slightly. "Clean up your act, Jameson," he said simply. Then, without another word, he was gone. Jameson exhaled shakily, feeling the sweat on the back of his neck, because he wasn't sure what was worse. The fact that he'd just been publicly humbled, or the fact that he didn't know what happened next. And for the first time in years, Jameson Carter was terrified. Jameson stood in the center of the kitchen, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of what had just happened clung to him like a second skin. Shaquille O'Neal, the owner of the Iron Oak, the man Jameson had just spent the entire night belittling, mocking, and challenging. And now, that same man was standing in front of him, looking at him like he was a problem that needed fixing. The kitchen staff had gone back to work, but their movements were mechanical, distracted. They weren't focused on the food. They were waiting for what would happen next. Shaq exhaled slowly, then turned to Jameson. His voice was calm but unshakable. "You want to keep this job?" he asked. Jameson stiffened, his pride screaming at him not to answer. Shaq didn't wait for a response. "Apologize to Earl," he said. "Right here, right now." The air froze. Jameson's breath caught in his throat. He felt every set of eyes on him. The line cooks, the sous chefs, the dishwashers, the waitstaff peeking in from the doorway. And most of all, Earl. The old man hadn't moved. He was still standing near the dish pit, hands wrinkled from decades of hard work, shoulders slightly hunched from years of carrying weight that wasn't just physical. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired. Tired in a way that made Jameson's stomach twist uncomfortably. Jameson scoffed, forcing out a breathy laugh, trying to regain some kind of control. "You're joking, right?" he said, shaking his head. "You think an apology is going to fix anything?" Shaq didn't blink. "Nope." Jameson let out another laugh, louder this time. Forced, brittle. "This is a kitchen, not a damn therapy session," he muttered, crossing his arms. "People don't apologize in kitchens. You screw up, you move on." Shaq nodded. "That how you do things?" "That's how everyone does things," Jameson shot back. Shaq turned slightly, looking around the room. "You agree with that?" he asked the staff. No one answered. Jameson felt his pulse quicken. Shaq looked back at him. "Seems like it's just you." Jameson clenched his jaw, his pride screaming at him not to back down. But his job was on the line. His reputation was on the line. He looked around, hoping for support, some kind of validation from his staff, but all he saw was quiet disappointment. And somehow, that felt worse than anger. His throat tightened, his body tense. He swallowed, then turned to Earl. "Sorry," he muttered, barely above a whisper. Shaq's face didn't change. "Say it like you mean it," he said. "Or walk out." Jameson's heart skipped. He looked at Shaq, searching his face, hoping, praying, that there was some kind of leeway, some room to maneuver. There wasn't. Jameson's fingers curled into fists. Everything inside him fought against this. But deep down, he knew. Shaq wasn't bluffing. If he didn't do this, he was done. So he forced himself to look at Earl again. The old man met his gaze, his expression unreadable. And for the first time, Jameson really saw him. Saw the years of silent endurance. Saw the way he had taken every insult, every dismissal, every moment of disrespect and kept going. Jameson exhaled, his body feeling strangely heavy. "I'm sorry," he said again, but this time his voice was steady. A pause. Then Earl nodded. "All right." Jameson blinked. "That's it?" Earl shrugged. "What else you want?" Jameson didn't know how to answer that. He had spent so much time pushing people down, using power like a shield, that he had forgotten what it actually meant to be human. Shaq watched him carefully. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. Good. Jameson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Shaq stepped back, giving him space. Now get back to work. Jameson hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to the line. The kitchen slowly came back to life. But something was different. The tension had shifted. Jameson could feel it. A weight lifted, but something else put in its place. Something he wasn't sure he understood yet. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to. Jameson stood frozen, his mind stuck between two choices: ego or survival. The kitchen had already returned to work, but the shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Conversations were quieter, movements more deliberate, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was something else. Something Jameson didn't recognize. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to do. His hands twitched at his sides, his fingers curled into fists before relaxing again. The weight of Shaq's words still lingered in the air. Apologize to Earl, like you mean it, or walk out. Jameson had spent years perfecting his ability to deflect, to push blame onto others, to move forward without ever looking back. But now with the entire kitchen watching without watching, waiting to see what came next, he couldn't move forward without facing this. His throat felt tight, like the words were being dragged out of him against his will. But then, finally, he let go. He turned toward Earl, his jaw still tight, but this time, there was no venom, no deflection, no excuse. I'm sorry, Jameson said. For real this time. Earl looked up, his tired eyes searching Jameson's face for something real, something honest. Jameson held his gaze. For once, he didn't look away. A moment passed, then another. Earl gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. All right, he said simply. Jameson let out a breath, one that felt heavier than he expected. And just like that, it was done. Not erased, not forgotten, but acknowledged. And somehow that felt like something. He turned back to Shaq, half expecting a smug look, some kind of victory speech. But Shaq wasn't gloating. He was just watching, waiting. Then, finally, he nodded once. Now let's see if you can cook with less hate in your hands. Jameson felt something cold twist in his stomach, because deep down he knew that was the real challenge, and he wasn't sure if he could pass it. The Iron Oak would never be the same again. It wasn't an obvious shift. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic moments of realization. But the energy in the kitchen had changed. For the first time in years, there was no fear hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The staff moved with the same urgency, but their eyes didn't dart around, scanning for their next verbal lashing. The weight that had pressed down on them for so long had lifted, just slightly. And Jameson? He wasn't the same either. He didn't say much after Shaq's final words. Didn't argue. Didn't fight back. He just went back to work, but something in his movements felt different. Less about proving his dominance and more about proving something else. Maybe to himself. Maybe to the people around him. Or maybe to the one man who had seen right through him. Shaq stood near the exit, watching it all unfold. This wasn't about a kitchen. It wasn't even about a restaurant. It was about people. About how a leader could shape them or break them. And Jameson had spent too many years breaking. Shaq exhaled, stepping toward the door. But before leaving, he paused. He glanced over his shoulder, his deep voice rolling through the kitchen like distant thunder. You can scream at people, or you can lead them. Your choice. Jameson, standing at the pass, didn't look up, but he heard it. They all did. And the lesson? It would stay long after Shaq was gone. Near the dish station, Earl wiped his hands on a rag. He had spent years in this kitchen, invisible and ignored. But today felt different. A small, quiet smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, the first in a long, long time. And this time, no one looked past him. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And real leadership It's never built on fear. What would you do if you saw injustice unfold right in front of you? Would you speak up or stay silent? Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the loudest, it's the one who's watching. And when the moment comes, will you be ready to step in?